There are some lives that seem to float above the rest of the world, suspended in a golden haze of beauty, privilege, and fairy tale promise. These stories unfold in grand palaces and glittering ballrooms, images we admire and envy, believing the endings are as perfect as the portraits. We see the perfect princess, the storybook wedding, the life of quiet, dignified service, and we assume we know the ending, an ending as placid and graceful as life itself. But history has a way of shattering its own most beautiful creations. It takes the most delicate and perfect portraits and rips them from their gilded frames. The serene melody is interrupted by a sound of such violence, it tears a hole in the fabric of reality. And what emerges from that wreckage is something far more complex, far more terrifying, and ultimately far more profound than the fairy tale we thought we knew. The life that was meant to be written in gold leaf is instead rewritten in blood, tears, and an ink of unshakable faith. Today, we journey into the heart of one such life, a life that began in the sunlit, ordered world of Queen Victoria's court, a world of rigid certainties and dynastic alliances, but ended in the frozen, blood-soaked darkness of a Siberian mineshaft. It is the story of a woman once considered the most beautiful princess in all of Europe, a woman who seemed destined for a life of idyllic splendor at the heart of the world's most opulent empire. Instead, a single deafening explosion on a frozen Moscow street would change everything, setting her on a path so radical, so self-sacrificing, and so courageous that it continues to defy belief. This is the story of Princess Elisabeth of Hesse, and by Rhine, later the Grand Duchess Elisabeth Feodorovna of Russia. A woman whose journey from princess to saint forces us to ask the most difficult questions about faith, the nature of evil, and the astonishing, almost superhuman resilience of the human heart. Join us as we uncover the astonishing, heartbreaking, and deeply inspiring life of the princess who walked away from a throne to find her soul. To understand the extraordinary trajectory of Elizabeth's life, you first have to breathe the air of the world she was born into. It was a world that felt both ancient and eternal, a continent bound together not just by treaties and trade, but by the intricate, sprawling web of family. This was the era of the great royal cousinhood, where the thrones of Britain, Germany, Russia, and half a dozen other nations were occupied by a network of uncles, aunts, and first cousins. A family gathering could look like a summit of nations, and the private letters exchanged between Nikki in St. Petersburg, Georgie in London, and Willie in Berlin held the fate of millions in their cursive script. The personal rivalries and affections of these cousins could soothe diplomatic tensions or ignite the flames of war. It was a world built on the fragile assumption that blood was thicker than politics. Elizabeth Alexandra Louisa Alice was born on the 1st of November, 1864, not into a minor royal house, but into the very heart of this dynastic network. Her father was Ludwig IV, the Grand Duke of the small but respected German state of Hesse, and by Rhine. Her mother was Princess Alice, the second daughter and third child of the most powerful woman in the world, Queen Victoria of Great Britain. This made Elizabeth known to her family simply as Ella, the granddaughter of the great empress herself. Her childhood was spent in the clean, orderly, and emotionally reserved environment of the new palace in Darmstadt. It was a life of structure and discipline, but one punctuated by frequent formative visits to England. There, she and her siblings would be immersed in the world of Windsor Castle, Osborne House, and the rugged highlands of Balmoral, under the watchful, loving, yet undeniably formidable eye of their grandmother. Queen Victoria adored Ella. she saw in this particular grandchild a rare combination of qualities. It wasn't just her breathtaking beauty, which was evident from a very young age, but a gentle, artistic, and deeply sensitive soul. From a young age, Ella's looks were the talk of European courts. She was tall and slender, with a perfect oval face, large, deep, gray-blue eyes that seemed to hold a hint of melancholy, and an expression that radiated a gentle, almost otherworldly calm. But her mother, Princess Alice, was determined that her children would not grow up to be merely decorative ornaments. Alice was a woman ahead of her time, a true heir to the progressive ideals of her father, Prince Albert. A passionate advocate for nursing and public health, she was a friend and admirer of Florence Nightingale, with whom she corresponded for years about hospital design and sanitation reform. During the Austro-Prussian War, Alice didn't just sponsor charities from afar. She rolled up her sleeves, organized field hospitals, and personally visited the wounded, shocking the more traditional members of the court. She instilled in all her children, and especially in Ella, a powerful sense of duty and compassion. This wasn't the abstract charity of the distant aristocrat. Alice would take her children with her on visits to hospitals, workshops, and orphanages, teaching them that their privilege came with a profound hands-on responsibility to care for those less fortunate. This was a lesson that would sink deep into Ella's soul, a seed planted in the rich soil of her childhood that would, decades later, blossom in the most astonishing way. Tragedy, however, would strike this idyllic family early and with devastating force. First, in 1873, her younger brother Friedrich, affectionately called Fritty, a hemophiliac, died from a brain hemorrhage after a fall from a window. The agonizing helplessness of watching the little boy bleed to death internally left a permanent scar on the family. Then, in 1878, when Ella was just 14, a diphtheria epidemic swept through Darmstadt, infecting nearly the entire ducal family. Princess Alice nursed them tirelessly, her medical knowledge far surpassing that of a typical royal. But she couldn't save everyone. Her youngest daughter, Marie, died from the illness. In her overwhelming grief, Alice broke her own strict rules of quarantine and kissed her grieving son, Ernest, an act which sealed her own fate. She contracted the disease and died shortly after, on the 17th anniversary of her own father's death, at the age of just 35. The loss of her mother was the first great rupture in Ella's young life. It thrust her, at the tender age of 14, into the role of surrogate mother to her younger siblings. Among them was a little girl just 6 years old named Alex. Alex, who had been a sunny, cheerful child, was shattered by her mother's death and would now cling to her older sister Ella as her anchor in a world suddenly turned dark and frightening. The bond between Ella and Alex became unbreakable, a deep and loving sisterhood that would define both of their lives and ultimately entwine their fates in the grand, tragic destiny of Russia. As Ella blossomed into womanhood, her beauty became legendary. Suitors from across the continent vied for her hand. One of the most ardent was her own cousin, the future Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany. Willie, as the family called him, was a complex and troubled young man, brash, intelligent, and deeply insecure, in part due to a withered arm from a birth injury. He was utterly infatuated with Ella, writing her passionate poetry and pursuing her relentlessly. But Ella, with a quiet strength and an unerring intuition that belied her gentle demeanor, turned him down flat. She saw through his blustering confidence to the harshness beneath, a militaristic arrogance that repelled her sensitive nature. It was a decision that would prove remarkably prescient, sparing her the fate of being empress of a Germany that would soon plunge the world into war. Her refusal showed she was far more than just a pretty face. She possessed a will of iron beneath her serene exterior, a clear sense of her own character and what she sought in a partner. Her heart, as it turned out, was drawn not to the bluster of the German court, but to the mystique and grandeur of the East. It was drawn to a man she had known since childhood, a man who was in many ways her opposite. He was Grand Duke Sergei Alexandrovich of Russia, the fifth son of Tsar Alexander II. Sergei was a striking figure, tall and imposing, intensely devout, reserved to the point of seeming cold, and a man of strong, uncompromising principles. He was not an easy man, but during a visit to Darmstadt he was utterly captivated by Ella's grace, her artistic soul, and her quiet dignity. And she, in turn, was drawn to his deep religious faith and his shared passion for art and culture. There was a solemnity in him that resonated with the part of her that had been shaped by early grief. While others saw Sergei as stern and aloof, Ella saw a man of profound conviction and a quiet, steadfast loyalty. When they married in the glittering splendor of the Grand Church of the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg on June 15, 1884, it was the society event of the year. Ella, just 19 years old, was now a Grand Duchess of Russia. The transition was a shock to the senses. She had stepped out of the relatively modest, ordered Protestant world of her youth and into the opulent, dramatic, and deeply mystical world of the Romanovs. The scale of everything was different. The palaces were vast seas of marble and malachite. The jewels were legendary, and the religious rituals were ancient, theatrical, and steeped in a mystery that was both intimidating and alluring. She had married into a family and a nation that was, at that very moment, perched on the edge of a volcano. The Russia she entered was a land of breathtaking contradictions, of unimaginable wealth and crushing poverty, of deep piety and simmering revolutionary fury. Her new life had begun, a life that promised everything, but that would demand a price beyond all imagining. For the first 2 decades of her marriage, the life of Grand Duchess Elisabeth Feodorovna, the name she took, though her family still called her Ella, was the very picture of imperial splendor and domestic contentment. She and Sergei made their home in Moscow after he was appointed Governor General in 1891, making them the most powerful figures in Russia's ancient capital. Moscow was not the cosmopolitan, European-facing St. Petersburg. It was the country's spiritual heart, a city of 1,000 times 1,000 churches, its skyline a forest of golden onion domes. It was more Russian, more traditional, more Asiatic, and more volatile. As the Tsar's representatives, Ella and Sergei lived at the center of this sacred, seething metropolis. Their primary residence, the Beloselsky-Belozersky Palace in St. Petersburg, was a jewel box of art and luxury, but it was their country estate, Ilinsko, outside Moscow, where they found their greatest happiness, creating an English-style country life in the heart of Russia. Here, they could escape the rigid formality of the court, picnicking, riding, and hosting intimate gatherings. Their marriage was by all accounts a complex but deeply devoted one. They shared a profound religious faith and a passion for art and culture. Sergei was a connoisseur, and with Ella's impeccable taste, they became great patrons of Russian art, supporting artists and craftsmen who were reviving traditional Russian styles. However, they would have no children. The reasons for this have long been the subject of historical speculation, with many sources suggesting that Grand Duke Sergei was homosexual. While this can never be definitively proven, it adds a layer of poignant complexity to their relationship. It's possible that theirs was a union based more on shared spiritual and aesthetic values than on physical passion, a partnership of souls. Whatever the private nature of their union, their public face was one of complete solidarity and mutual affection. They found a different way to build a family, eventually taking on the guardianship of Sergei's orphaned niece and nephew, Maria and Dmitri Pavlovich, after their father was exiled. Ella poured her maternal love into these two children, raising them as her own and providing them a stability they desperately needed. Ella quickly became one of the most beloved members of the imperial family. While other Grand Duchesses might have spent their days in idle luxury, she threw herself into her duties with the same compassion her mother had taught her. She organized committees for the relief of the poor, sponsored charities, and was particularly dedicated to helping impoverished women and children. Yet, she did not lose her love for beauty. She was renowned for her exquisite taste in clothes and jewels, and was considered one of the best-dressed women in the empire. She moved through the glittering world of Romanov court balls and state ceremonies with an unmatched grace and elegance. She was, in every outward respect, the perfect Grand Duchess. But even in this gilded world, she never lost her sense of spiritual seeking. She was born and raised a Lutheran, a faith of sober reason and simple devotion. But she found herself increasingly drawn to the faith of her new homeland, Russian Orthodoxy. This was not a superficial attraction to the magnificent rituals and incense-filled cathedrals, though that was part of it. For an artistic soul like Ella, the beauty was a gateway. She was moved by the sublime otherworldly harmonies of the all-night vigils, the flickering candlelight illuminating the faces of ancient icons, the tangible sense of heaven touching earth. She spent 7 years studying the language, reading theological texts, and speaking with priests. This was not a conversion of convenience, which was not required of her. It was a deep personal and intellectual journey. When she finally wrote to her father in 1891 to announce her decision to convert, she explained it with a clarity and passion that revealed the depth of her conviction. "I have come to this conclusion," she wrote, "that only in this religion can I find all the true and strong faith in God one must have to be a good Christian." Her family in Germany and England, particularly Queen Victoria, was dismayed. The Queen, a staunch Protestant, wrote her a letter of sharp disapproval, warning her that her decision caused her great pain. For Ella, this was a difficult but necessary break. Orthodoxy was not just her husband's faith, it had become her own. It was a homecoming. She had found the spiritual anchor that would hold her steady in the unimaginable storm to come. That profound connection to her younger sister, Alex, would soon place both of them at the very apex of the Russian Empire. In 1894, Alex, following her heart, married Tsar Alexander III's heir, Nicholas, and became Empress Alexandra Feodorovna of Russia. The two sisters, who had clung to each other after their mother's death, were now at the very apex of the Russian Empire. Ella was both a sister and a mentor to the shy, anxious new empress, guiding her through the treacherous protocols of the Russian court and providing a constant source of love and support. But as the new century dawned, the ground beneath their perfect world began to tremble. Russia was a nation in turmoil. A humiliating defeat in the Russo-Japanese War and growing civil unrest fueled the flames of revolution. Grand Duke Sergei, as Governor-General of Moscow, became a lightning rod for this hatred. His conservative politics and unyielding enforcement of the Tsar's will, including the expulsion of 20,000 Jews from Moscow, made him a prime target for revolutionary groups who saw him as a symbol of the autocracy's tyranny. Ella was keenly aware of the danger. Threats against her husband's life became constant. Anarchist and socialist revolutionary groups openly sentenced him to death. She lived in a state of perpetual anxiety, begging him to take more precautions. But he was a fatalist, believing his life was in God's hands. The inevitable finally happened on a bitterly cold afternoon, February 17th, 1905. Grand Duke Sergei was leaving the Kremlin in his carriage on his way to a meeting. Ella was preparing to join him for a journey out of the city, but was delayed. She was waiting in her rooms at the Nicholas Palace when she heard it, a deafening explosion that shook the ancient fortress to its foundations. It was a sound so loud, so violent, that the windows of the palace shattered. She knew, with a certainty that froze the blood in her veins, what had happened. She didn't scream. She didn't faint. She gathered her skirts and ran outside without a coat into the snow. What she found was a scene from a nightmare. The carriage was obliterated. Her husband's body had been literally torn to pieces by the force of the nitroglycerin bomb. The snow was stained red, littered with debris and the gruesome scattered remains of the man she loved. Eyewitnesses watched in stunned silence as the Grand Duchess, her face a mask of stone, knelt in the bloody snow and began to gather the dismembered parts of her husband's body onto a stretcher. His coachman, who had also been killed, lay nearby. The fairy tale was over. The portrait had been shattered into a million pieces. For Ella, life as she had known it had just ended in the most violent and horrific way imaginable. And in that moment of absolute devastation, something new, something unbreakable was being forged in the crucible of her grief. In the days that followed her husband's horrific assassination, the Russian court, and indeed all of Europe, watched Ella with a mixture of pity and awe. They expected a widow's grief, seclusion, black veils, a collapse into despair, and she did grieve. The shock and horror of what she had witnessed left a wound that would never fully heal. In the privacy of the Kremlin chapel, she meticulously sewed his mutilated body back together so that he could have a proper open casket funeral, an act of final heartbreaking devotion. But what she did next was so far beyond the realm of conventional behavior that it stunned everyone and revealed the first true glimpse of the saint she was to become. A few days after the murder, while the revolutionary who threw the bomb, a 28-year-old poet and member of the Socialist Revolutionary Party's combat organization, named Ivan Kalyayev, was being held in prison, Ella made a request that horrified her family. She wanted to visit him. This was unthinkable. It bordered on a political scandal. To seek out the man who had ripped her husband to pieces, to willingly stand in his presence, it seemed like an act of madness, a sign that her grief had unhinged her. Her relatives pleaded with her not to go, arguing it was undignified and would be seen as weakness by the revolutionaries. But Ella was insistent. This was not about politics. It was about souls. She arrived at the prison, a tall, graceful figure dressed in black, her face pale but composed. She was led to Kalyayev's cell. There, she came face to face with the man who had destroyed her world. He was unrepentant, a fervent ideologue who believed his act was a righteous blow against tyranny. She carried with her not a message of hatred or a demand for vengeance, but a Bible. She spoke to him not as a Grand Duchess to a terrorist, but as one human soul to another. She told him that she did not come to him in her own name, but in the name of his victim, Sergei. She said that her husband had forgiven him before he died, and then she spoke the words that would echo through history, "I forgive you." She pleaded with him to repent, to save his own soul, telling him she would pray for him. He was reportedly moved by her visit, but remained steadfast in his convictions. He told her his act was a political one, and he would die for it. He saw her as a representative of a system he had sworn to destroy. She saw him as a lost child of God. She left the Bible in his cell, hoping he would read it. Her act of grace did not end there. She then wrote a personal letter to her nephew, Tsar Nicholas II, formally petitioning him to pardon her husband's killer. She, the victim, was begging for mercy for the perpetrator. The Tsar, bound by the laws of the state and the immense pressure of the political situation, refused. Ivan Kalyaev was hanged, but Ella's act of radical Christ-like forgiveness became a legend. It was an act so pure, so completely devoid of personal ego or thirst for revenge, that it seemed to belong to another, higher world. From that moment on, Ella's life took a dramatic and irreversible turn. The world of court balls, exquisite gowns, and idle pleasantries now felt utterly hollow to her. The assassination had not just taken her husband, it had burned away everything that was superficial in her life, leaving only the core of her profound faith. She began to withdraw from society, spending more and more of her time in prayer and visiting holy sites. She became a vegetarian and adopted a much simpler lifestyle within the palace walls. Her family, especially her sister, the Empress Alexandra, grew deeply concerned. They saw her deep piety as an extreme, unhealthy reaction to her grief. They couldn't understand the transformation they were witnessing. But for Ella, it was not a retreat from life, but an embrace of a new, more meaningful one. She made a decision that was, for a woman of her rank, utterly revolutionary. She announced she was going to renounce her titles, her wealth, and her position in society to found a new religious order, a convent in the heart of Moscow. She gathered all of her magnificent jewels, the diamonds, the emeralds, the legendary pearls she was famous for, and divided them. One part went to the crown, one part to her adopted children, and the rest she sold. This act cannot be overstated. For a Romanov, jewels were not just adornments, they were a part of the imperial identity, symbols of power and permanence. By selling them, she was performing a symbolic abdication of her former self. With the vast proceeds, she purchased a large estate on Bolshaya Ordinka Street in Moscow. She kept only her wedding ring and a simple wooden cross. In 1909, the convent of Saints Martha and Mary of Mercy officially opened its doors. But this was to be no ordinary convent, hidden away from the world in quiet contemplation. Ella envisioned something new, an order of women who would combine the contemplative life of prayer with active, hands-on service to the poorest and most desperate people in the city. She became the abbess of her new order, and on April 10, 1910, along with a small group of dedicated women, she made a vow to serve God by serving the suffering. The sight of the former Grand Duchess, now in the simple white and gray habit of her order, became a familiar one in the most dangerous and squalid slums of Moscow. She and her sisters would descend into the Kitrov market, a notorious den of thieves, prostitutes, and homeless alcoholics, a place so dangerous the police often feared to enter. They would go into filthy, overcrowded cellars to find abandoned children, tend to the sick, and clean the wounds of the dying. Ella, the woman raised in the pristine halls of Windsor Castle, showed no fear or revulsion. She would personally bathe sick children, bandage festering sores, and sit with the dying, holding their hands and praying with them. She learned nursing skills to better serve the sick. Her convent became a beacon of hope in the city. It housed a state-of-the-art hospital, a pharmacy that gave away medicine for free, an orphanage for girls, and a soup kitchen that fed hundreds of hungry people every day. She had created a revolutionary institution, blending deep spirituality with practical social work. She was no longer Grand Duchess Elisabeth Feodorovna. To the poor of Moscow, she was simply Matushka, the Little Mother. She had found her true calling, not as a princess, but as a servant. While Ella was building her sanctuary of mercy in Moscow, a dark shadow was falling over her sister's family in St. Petersburg. The imperial court was in the grip of Grigory Rasputin, the mystical peasant from Siberia who seemed to be the only one who could ease the suffering of the young heir, Alexei, who had inherited hemophilia from their grandmother, Queen Victoria. For Empress Alexandra, every day was a torment, watching her beloved son live on the brink of death from the slightest bump or bruise. The doctors were powerless. But Rasputin, with his hypnotic presence and fervent prayers, seemed able to stop the bleeding when no one else could. To the desperate mother, he was not a charlatan. He was a holy man sent by God. Ella saw Rasputin for what he was, a manipulative charlatan whose debauched behavior and growing political influence were destroying the reputation of the monarchy. Her intuition, the same intuition that had led her to reject Kaiser Wilhelm years earlier, was screaming that this man was a source of pure evil. She tried desperately to warn her sister. She traveled to the Alexander Palace at Tsarskoye Selo for a final heartbreaking confrontation in 1916. She begged Alex to listen, to send Rasputin away, to see the damage he was doing to the Tsar, to the family, and to Russia itself. She warned that the entire country saw him as a German spy and a corrupting influence, and that their continued association with him would lead to their destruction. But the Empress Alexandra, her mind clouded by her desperate love for her son and her fanatical belief in Rasputin as a man of God, refused to listen. She saw Ella's warnings as a betrayal, an attack on her faith, and her choices as a mother. The two sisters, who had been each other's closest confidants their entire lives, parted in anger and sorrow. It was the last time they would ever see each other. Ella left the palace with a heavy heart, knowing that her sister and the entire Romanov dynasty was racing towards a terrifying abyss from which she could not save them. This painful rift highlights one of the great what-ifs of the period. Ella possessed a clear-sightedness and moral courage that was tragically absent in the isolated world of the Tsar and Tsarina. While they retreated further into a bubble of mysticism and denial, Ella was on the front lines, her hands deep in the gritty reality of her suffering country. She understood the desperation of the Russian people in a way her sister, insulated in her palace, never could. There is also the lingering, complex question of her husband, Grand Duke Sergei. In the historical narrative, he is often portrayed as a villain, a reactionary, anti-Semitic, and cruel governor whose harsh policies made him a hated figure. His brutal assassination is sometimes seen as a form of revolutionary justice. This complicates our view of Ella. Was her devotion to a man who was, by many accounts, a tyrant, a sign of political blindness? The truth is more nuanced. To her, Sergei was not a political symbol. He was her husband, the man she had built a life with, a partner in faith and art. Her forgiveness of his killer was not a political statement about his governorship. It was a profound spiritual act, completely detached from the politics of the moment. She mourned the man, not the governor general. Her ability to separate the soul of the individual from their public role, both in her husband's case and his killer's, is precisely what made her actions so radical. She operated on a spiritual plane that transcended the bitter, violent politics of her era. Her life was not about judging the past, but about redeeming the future through acts of mercy. It was this singular focus that set her apart and ultimately sealed her fate in the coming revolution that would spare no one, not even a living saint. The final act of Ella's life played out against the backdrop of the greatest political cataclysm of the 20th century. When World War I broke out in 1914, she turned her convent into a powerhouse of war relief, sending nurses and supplies to the front and tending to wounded soldiers in her own hospital. But the war was a disaster for Russia, and in 1917, the storm that had been brewing for decades finally broke. The February Revolution forced Tsar Nicholas II to abdicate. The Romanov dynasty had fallen. In the chaotic months that followed, as a provisional government struggled to maintain order, Ella continued her work at the convent, a small island of peace in a sea of turmoil. But then came the October Revolution, and the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, seized power. Their reign began with a wave of terror aimed at wiping out the old order, the aristocracy, the bourgeoisie, and most especially, the church. Even in this new brutal world, Ella's reputation as a servant of the poor gave her a degree of protection. The people of Moscow loved her, but to the cold, atheistic ideologues of the new regime, she was a symbol of everything they sought to destroy. She was a Romanov, a princess by birth and marriage, and she was a powerful religious figure, a class enemy, and a propagator of the opiate of the masses. Her goodness was irrelevant. Her fate was predetermined by her name and her faith. The German ambassador, sensing the rising danger, offered her safe passage to Germany. She refused without a moment's hesitation. She would not abandon her sisters or her adopted country in its hour of greatest need. "I have shared their joy," she said. "Now I will share their sorrow." In May 1918, on the third day of Easter, the secret police, the Cheka, arrived at the gates of the convent of Martha and Mary. The order had come directly from Lenin. The Grand Duchess was to be arrested. She was given just 30 minutes to pack. She remained perfectly calm, gathering her sisters for a final prayer and blessing. As she was led away, a large crowd of weeping Muscovites gathered, trying to protest her arrest, but they were powerless against the Bolshevik guns. She was first taken to Perm and then to the small town of Alapayevsk in the Ural Mountains, where she was imprisoned in a schoolhouse along with several other members of the extended imperial family. Her final days were spent in prayer and in caring for her fellow prisoners, her calm and faith a source of strength for everyone. She would organize their days around prayer, lead them in singing hymns, and do her best to tend to their needs, maintaining a sense of dignity and order in the face of total uncertainty. She never complained, never showed fear. She knew her end was near, and she faced it with the same serene acceptance she had shown throughout her life. The end came on the night of July 18th, 1918. It was just 24 hours after her sister Alexandra, her husband the Tsar, and their 5 children had been brutally murdered in a cellar in the nearby city of Yekaterinburg. Unaware of her sister's fate, Ella and her companions were woken in the middle of the night by Bolshevik soldiers, many of whom were drunk. They were told they were being moved to a safer location, a common lie used before an execution. They were loaded onto peasant carts and driven out into the dark forest. The carts stopped at the edge of a deep abandoned iron ore mineshaft known as Lower Selimskaya. The prisoners' hands were bound and they were blindfolded. Then the horror began. One by one, the soldiers struck them on the head with the butts of their rifles and pushed them, some conscious, some not, into the blackness of the pit. Ella was one of the first to be pushed in, but the fall didn't kill them. To finish the job, the soldiers began tossing hand grenades down into the shaft. One of the local peasants who had been forced to witness the massacre later reported something that chills the blood. After the first grenade exploded, he could hear, faint and otherworldly, a sound rising from the depths of the mine. It was the sound of singing. It was Ella and the others, broken and dying in the darkness, singing hymns. According to the testimony, she was leading them in the cherubic hymn, a song of the holy angels that is sung during the Orthodox liturgy just before the Eucharist, symbolizing the faithful preparing to receive Christ, the King of all. The singing continued, growing fainter and fainter, until at last there was only silence. Months later, when the anti-Bolshevik White Army temporarily recaptured the area, they investigated the site. What they found in the mineshaft was both horrific and profound. The bodies were recovered, and an autopsy revealed that most of the victims had not died from the grenade blasts, but had slowly succumbed to their injuries and starvation. The body of one of the younger princes had a head wound that had been crudely bandaged. The bandage had been made from a piece of cloth torn from the apostolic veil of a nun's habit. Even in her final agonizing moments, her head injured and her body broken, Ella's last act on earth had been one of compassion, tearing a piece of her own clothing to tend to the wounds of another. The historical significance of her life and death is immense. She represents the ultimate collision between two irreconcilable worlds, the world of deep Christian faith and self-sacrifice, and the world of cold totalitarian ideology that saw individual human life as utterly expendable for the sake of political theory. The Bolsheviks could imprison her body and destroy it, but they could not extinguish her spirit. The journey of her physical remains is an epic saga in itself. As the Red Army advanced, a devoted monk, with the help of the White Army, took her coffin and that of another nun martyred with her, and began an incredible, perilous journey to get them to safety. They traveled for over a year across the vastness of war-torn Siberia by train, by cart, and by foot, constantly evading Bolshevik patrols. They crossed into China, finding refuge in Harbin and then Beijing, where the coffins were placed in a church crypt. Finally, after arrangements were made by Ella's sister Victoria, the journey was completed. The coffins were taken by sea from Shanghai to Port Said in Egypt and then to the Holy Land. In 1921, Princess Elisabeth of Hesse, Grand Duchess Elisabeth Feodorovna of Russia, was laid to rest exactly as she had wished years before, in the crypt of the Church of St. Mary Magdalene on the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem. Her long journey was over. Her legacy is not that of a political figure, but of a spiritual giant. In 1981, she was canonized by the Russian Orthodox Church outside Russia, and then in 1992, after the fall of the Soviet Union, by the Moscow Patriarchate as Holy Martyr Elisabeth Feodorovna. Today, the convent of Martha and Mary, which was shut down and desecrated by the Soviets, used as a cinema and a clinic, has been reopened in Moscow. It stands once again as a center for charity and prayer, a living testament to its founder. Her story is a powerful reminder that even in the darkest, most violent chapters of human history, the light of compassion, forgiveness, and faith can shine with an unbreakable intensity. The story of Elisabeth, the princess they called Ella, is not in the end a tragedy. Tragedies end in defeat. Her story is one of ultimate victory. It is the story of a woman who was handed one of life's most gilded cups, filled with beauty, wealth, and status. She saw that cup shattered into 1,000 pieces by an act of brutal violence. But instead of trying to piece together the glittering fragments of her old life, she knelt down and began building something entirely new, something eternal. Her life challenges our modern definitions of strength and power. She shows us that true strength is not found in commanding others, but in serving them. That the greatest power is not the ability to condemn, but the courage to forgive. In an age so often defined by ideology, political hatred, and the pursuit of self-interest, her story stands as a radical counter-narrative. She walked away from a world that worshipped beauty and status and found her purpose in a world of poverty and sickness. She was stripped of her home, her family, and her life, but she never lost her dignity, her grace, or her faith. The portrait of the beautiful young princess in her silks and jewels is still there, preserved in archives and museums. But it is incomplete. It is just the first page of the story. The true picture of Ella is the one of her kneeling in the bloody snow, her face set with resolve. It is the picture of her in a prison cell, offering a Bible to her husband's murderer. It is the picture of her in the slums of Moscow, holding the hand of a dying child. And it is the final, haunting image of her, broken at the bottom of a mineshaft, using her last breath not to curse her killers, but to sing a hymn to her God.